Are you surprised by the fact that interest rates are expected to go up once more?
Well, look, the independence of the Bank of England from politicians is clearly important for these decisions, but I think we all expect this to go one way today. Inflation is a huge problem, and it is a huge problem, particularly for people on lower incomes, because it erodes their spending power. But the job of the government, the job of any government right now, should be to ask, why is the UK such an outlier now when it comes to this very high rate of inflation? So the US is coming in at 4%, the Eurozone just over 6%. And the job of the government is to make sure we are minimising those inflationary pressures and learning lessons from the crisis that we have just been through. So I would give you three things that be very direct examples of that. First of all, we've been so exposed to the price of gas, to fossil fuels. We need to minimise that in future, and I think the government is going in the wrong direction on that. We need more people being able to
Well,
work in the
they would say
economy.
that by
Many people want to work
drilling
but
oil,
can't because they're on
Sorry,
NHS
Jonathan, but
waiting
we
lists.
spoke to the government yesterday on this, and they said that that by exactly the opposite of that, they said that by drilling for oil and gas in the North Sea, it improves our energy security.
Well, that's simply not true, and it's pretty easy to validate that. Look at Energy Expert and what they say. The crucial issue of our exposure to fossil fuels, and particularly the price of gas, is that it's not the quantity or where we get it from that's the problem. It's our exposure to the overall price, which will be set by regional and international market conditions. So we weren't a country that was dependent, for instance, on Russian gas to any large degree, but we were heavily exposed, not just in terms of our heating needs to the price of gas and industrial needs, but we set the price of electricity that way as well. So while you've got that exposure, you're going to be in this position where you are incredibly vulnerable to future rises and spikes in price. And that is well established, and the government kind of knows that, but I think is deliberately trying to ignore the evidence around that. I'd also say we've got a lot of people who are on NHS waiting lists right now who are desperate to get back to work, who can't. So our policy to scrap the non-dom rule, put those resources into a bigger NHS workforce, that's a crucial downward pressure on inflation. And finally, our trade deal with the European Union. We don't have an agreement that covers food and agricultural prices. We've got unnecessary checks in place, I would say, because we've got the same standards still in place. All of these things are the kind of agenda the government should be pursuing, alongside what is always going to be, I admit, difficult decisions from the Bank of England in terms of how much pain they cause people.
Indeed. But as you point out, the independence of the Bank of England from the government is important. It's not something that Labour would seek to change, is it, when if you were to come to power?
No, it was the Labour government in 1997 that made the Bank of England independent, precisely for this reason. So what you don't want to see are decisions on interest rates that are necessary for the economy being deferred by short-term political factors. We did see a lot of that under the boom and bust years of the Conservative governments prior to 97. We wanted to end that, and that is why it is there. But it doesn't mean there's no responsibility on the government. First of all, to make sure we have an economy which is resilient and is resistant to some of those pressures. Now, clearly, we haven't got that at the minute compared to our peers, but also specifically for people understandably having a real painful situation in response to this. We have, for instance, said the regulator should make sure people can switch their mortgage to an interest-only mortgage if they need to, and then switch it back whenever they want to do that. They should be able to extend the term of their mortgage as well. So they're still going to have a very painful experience. There's no doubt about that. But where help can be given to people, that's what we want to see.
Let's just ask you about another one of the stories that's in the news today. President Trump, I mean, he's facing another load of charges. We're going to be talking about that more in a short while. But were he to get back in as president of the United States, which does seem possible, according to all of those who are watching what is happening over there, were Keir Starmer to get in as Prime Minister here in the UK, how do you think they would work together? Would Keir Starmer work with President Trump?
Look, any UK Prime Minister has to work with the US President as a shared agenda on a whole range of issues. And to be frank, the security of all of Europe is dependent on NATO, of which obviously the US is a major component. But it would be a very challenging situation. I mean, if you look at I don't think we've learned anything new from the indictments that were published, but it is a damning case. And to see a senior US political figure, in this case, a former president, act and behave in such a way is something that should concern all of us. And I think it's a trend to a populism in many democratic countries, which poses real threats to our own national security here in the UK. So this is a very, very challenging situation. But I would have a lot of confidence, to be frank, in the economic record of the incumbent president in the US. But of course, these are matters for the US electorate when they do get their presidential election.
Indeed. Matters for Labour, if you were to get in, would be foreign spending. We spoke a lot about international aid and the cuts to international aid yesterday on Sky. Labour, you said you're committed to getting back to 0.7% spending on foreign aid, so that's increasing it from what the Conservatives have knocked it down for. But you're still not publishing spending plans. Shouldn't Labour be being more specific about what actually it is going to spend money on in advance of an election?
Well, I think we are specific. Whenever we have a spending pledge, we always would identify where that revenue comes from. So, for instance, things like scrapping the non-dom regime for the super rich and the money going into the NHS, we would be clear about that. There are many things, to be frank, where I would like to be able to come on a show like this and say, yes, we can address that problem, we can spend more money there. But if I can't say how we would raise that money, then I can't commit the Labour Party to doing it. And specifically, if you look at the strength of the economy over the last 13 years, it has not grown at a rate that anyone in the UK should be satisfied with. That does limit the options that are available. So the first priority for an incoming Labour government is to increase business investment, increase productivity, increase economic growth. And from there, you get the plans to do so. The other thing I say is one thing that is genuinely very difficult for the Labour Party right now is the baseline any opposition has to use are the government's own spending plans. And if you look at the decisions the Conservative Party has made and how they haven't themselves said how they will fulfil some of their pledges in the longer term, those departmental spending plans are a fantasy as it stands. And when you haven't got a reliable baseline, it is not easy to say how you would differ from that. But we'll get a chance when we get to the next financial year. I think we do anticipate that'll be the last one before the election to have a reliable baseline. I would hope that we can put forward those plans as it stands. But I'll always be frank with you and say, unless the economy and the performance of the economy in the UK improves, there will be much more limited possibilities for any political party at the next election. And that's why it's such a priority for us to improve the performance of the economy overall.
Final quick question for you. David T.C. Davis, the Welsh Secretary, Conservative Secretary, sent out a leaflet to constituents asking, would you like to see a traveller site next to your house? Do you think that's racist, asking that question?
It's difficult without knowing the specifics of that. I mean, there's a way to ask legitimate questions of your electorate and engage with them in a way which is seeking their views. And there's a time when sometimes people use language, I think, to not really engage with constituents, but to try and cause alarm, cause fear, and frankly use that for their own political ends. So I haven't seen that. And I wouldn't like to comment on it without doing so. But I would hope any colleague deals with these are difficult issues at times. Are they doing it sensitively? Are they doing it in good faith? And if they're not, they should be criticised for that. But if they're not, I'd give them some leeway on that. But I'd want to see the leaflet first.
OK, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for joining us, Jonathon Reynolds.